everyone, to the 2025 HxCanada Fall Conference. So I'll be your host for most of the morning. My name's Andy Selwood, so I'm a faculty member at Vancouver Community College. So Heterodox Academy seeks to further viewpoint diversity, constructive disagreement, and open inquiry in post-secondary. So as a community group of Heterodox Academy, we share this mission and seek to strengthen these values in Canadian post-secondary. So we now have campus communities, Heterodox campus communities at SFU, UBC Okanagan, McGill, McMaster, University of Toronto, University of Calgary, Waterloo, and Wilfrid Laurier, and maybe more on the way. So we have a lot of campus communities. So, but our view is viewpoint diversity, constructive disagreement, and open inquiry under threat in Canadian post-secondary? Or are we just importing some kind of US-rooted notions of a culture war into the Canadian context? There's been various campus expression surveys, but do they show that there's a problem? Is it convincing? So there's a lot of data out there, and I won't go through it all, but it does show that there is an issue with viewpoint diversity in Canadian post-secondary. There is an issue with self-censorship, and students and faculty, we know, are avoiding speaking their minds in class and in meetings. So I won't go through all the evidence, but there is the data that backs this up. So it kind of suggests that there's an orthodoxy and this sort of self-censorship in Canadian higher education and research. And I think it weakens our capacity to engage and discuss the many important and complex issues that should be talked about. And I want to point out, this is not just a problem for those who are right-leaning or moderates, but it's a problem for everyone in higher education. So we're also seeing a kind of a growing polarization, both in higher ed and largely politically. So I think we need to be concerned about this polarization and tackle it head on. We need to be able to explore openly the issues that divide us. But this is something that's kind of hard to do on Canadian campuses. We know that there are people at the extremes of these polarizing issues, but most of the people are not at the extremes. They might be sympathetic to these different positions, but I think there's a lot of people who are concerned when they see intolerance and extreme or illiberal behavior, not just from people on the other side, but from people on their side as well. So we're hoping this conference will give you some direction on how we can engage in civil dialogue and discussion and avoid having to pick a side and to get into the nuance of each issue. So we hope to demonstrate that it's possible to discuss difficult or divisive topics without dehumanizing or deriding others, and that to make real progress on any issue, we need to be open and listen to dissenting or critical views in addition to those that we agree with. So we picked a series of sessions and speakers that will get into the nuance, that will look at issues from different perspectives, and that will hopefully inspire you to do the same. So just some goals we have for today. We want to explore potentially divisive issues in a way that is honest, seeks nuance, and reflects the different views that exist on those issues. We want to model constructive disagreement across different viewpoints. We want to examine whether different initiatives in the post-secondary sector, such as EDI, have gone off track and may need to be reformed. And we want to demonstrate how improving viewpoint diversity and open inquiry benefits everyone. So, as illustrated in the Heterodox way, we welcome robust and constructive engagement across lines of difference. So if you disagree with something today, we welcome this and encourage you to engage respectfully and charitably. So, as mentioned, so we are seeing in the US how sort of external pressures on institutions can threaten academic freedom and institutional autonomy. But similar to the US, I think there is a need to reform Canadian post-secondary. And as the main sort of Heterodox Academy organization has outlined in their sort of reform agenda, it's internal reform that is critical to sort of meaningful change in higher education. So the Canadian context is different from the US, but I think there is much we can learn from what's happening in the US. So anyway, that's enough of me. So this brings us to our first speaker, who has demonstrated a laser-like understanding of kind of what's happening in US academia and maybe some ideas about how it can be fixed. So his book was my favorite book of 2025. We Have Never Been Woke, and I keep rereading it all the time. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce our keynote speaker, Musa al-Gharbi, who is a sociologist and author of We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. He is an assistant professor in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University and a columnist for The Guardian. His writing has also appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Atlantic, among other publications. So, round of applause for our keynote, Musa al-Gharbi.
I'm going to talk about diversity and knowledge production, how they relate to each other, why diversity is important for knowledge production, and how the quest for diversity sometimes goes off the rails. So let's start to set the stage. I think it's helpful to talk about some of the challenges that we face as knowledge producers. So, people in general, our cognitive and perceptual systems, they're not objectively oriented towards objectively perceiving the world in a dispassionate, uninterested way. Instead, there's a lot of research in the cognitive and behavioral sciences and psychology and a number of other fields that suggest that the way we perceive the world at a very fundamental level is geared towards advancing our interests and furthering our goals. As a consequence, all of us are prone to bias and error, and actually, you might hope, well, okay, sure, but the kind of people who are here in academia, we're not normal people, we're really smart, for instance. Well, the problem with that is if our cognitive and perceptual systems are primarily oriented towards advancing our own interests and furthering our goals, then people who are really cognitively sophisticated are especially good at reasoning in ways that advance our interests and further our goals. In fact, we're often more prone to many forms of bias and motivated reasoning. In addition to that, there are just limits to any individual person's capabilities, to their life experiences, to there are limits to our imagination. And as a result, for any person that you pick, the knowledge that they have is going to always be partial and situated by necessity. People are also fallible. We're prone to various kinds of oversights. We make mistakes. And knowledge of this fact, knowledge of our fallibility, knowledge of our limitations, knowledge that we're prone to bias doesn't eliminate any of those problems. In fact, it can exacerbate our blind spots in some cases to the extent that we think we're aware, unlike other people. To the extent that people internalize that kind of mentality, they can actually become more prone to various kinds of bias and oversight. So this is a big problem for people who are in the enterprise of producing knowledge. On top of this, scientists, we're not like randomly assigned our objects of study. We don't go into a science lottery and then pull out our ball and then do that. Instead, people tend to gravitate towards particular types of questions in particular fields. We gravitate towards particular methods. And how and why we tend to focus on the things we do is often usually informed by all sorts of really interesting personal motivations. And so our personal commitments and our fundamental beliefs shape what do we think are important questions to ask? What counts as evidence in virtue of what? What is a social problem rather than a social phenomenon? So for instance, if you understand inequality to be a social problem, you're baking into that formulation moral judgments and political judgments, as compared to understanding inequality as just a social phenomena that occurs in pretty much all societies. So what do you choose to study? Which perspectives do you choose to privilege? How do you define specific terms? These are judgments that we make that are informed in a deep way by our personal commitments and our objectives. You might think, well, okay, well, what we can do is we can just, we can get around some of these problems by just focusing on the facts. If we just focus on the data. There's two problems with this. One is that data aren't just things that occur in the world. The data are things that we produce through social processes, and how we interpret and analyze data is also deeply informed by all of these other things that we were just talking about before. So studies have consistently found you can give scientists the exact same data set and ask them to answer the exact same question using the exact same methods, and they'll come to radically divergent conclusions. And this is because there are all these degrees of freedom, even for people using the same data, using the same method to answer the same question. There are just all of these degrees of freedom that researchers have, and how we choose to, we make all of these little micro decisions on the basis of what we expect to find and what we hope to find, on our background and life experiences and so on, that color and shape the interpretations and the judgments we ultimately come to, even when we're working with the same data and the same methods and answering the same question. And that's true for any kind of science. That's true, but social science, if you're like me and you're a social scientist, social science is especially hard. It's especially hard for a number of reasons. So one of the ways, for instance, in which social science is just fundamentally different from physics, say, is that as far as we can tell, we could be wrong about this, but quarks don't really care if they're being observed. They don't really care about what the objectives of the scientist is, what it is the scientist is trying to prove and whatever. People are not like that. People do care that they're being observed. They care about who's observing them. They care who's asking the questions. There's all these studies that show you can ask respondents the same question and they answer in systematically different ways, depending on if it's in person versus remote versus online versus over the phone, depending on if the person asking them the question is a man versus a woman, is black versus white. It totally changes how people answer questions, or significantly changes how people answer questions. People have their own agency and their own interests, which might not line up with our own. So sometimes when researchers ask people about their beliefs, for instance, depending on the people we're asking, depending on what their assumptions are about who we are and what we're about, a regular thing that respondents do is troll researchers. So they give answers to questions that don't reflect their true beliefs, but are partisan cheerleading or things like this. Because again, the objects that we're studying have their own agenda. Social science is recursive in a way that physics isn't. So when we went from thinking that the Earth was at the center of the universe and the sun revolved around the Earth, to thinking that the sun is at the center of our universe, of our solar system, and the Earth revolves around the sun. When we shifted our understanding of the cosmos in that way, nothing actually changed in the universe. The position of the sun and the Earth didn't change. All that changed is our understanding of those things. Now, this is not the case when we study society. Our understandings of society can transform how society operates. So for instance, Marxism, like Marxist analysis was understood, was created as a means of trying to understand society, but it gave rise to whole different types of political movements, to new types of social orders, to different forms of economic arrangements and geopolitical competitions that totally changed the course of the 20th century and the 19th century, the 20th century. And so the studies have also found that when economists, like most people, don't really think and behave the way economists think they should, in the sense that they're not homo economicus, kind of rationally maximizing individualized agents. But the more people study economics, the more they behave that way. So people behave more like economists when they study economics. So this is a case in how our understanding of the world actually changes our social interactions. Okay. So social science is recursive. A lot of our rules that people study in physics, they're kind of universal for the most part. Like if I drop this, it accelerates at a rate of 9.8 meters per second squared. That's true if I drop this here versus in Antarctica, more or less. It's true, more or less, if I drop this in, 1800 versus if I drop it in 2025. It's just a universal rule. A lot of what we discover as social scientists isn't quite like that. Even the things that we discover that are true are often true in a bounded way. They're true of a particular group of people. They're true in particular circumstances. They're true at particular times. They might be less true in others. And then finally, social science is much more intimately bound up with questions about politics and morality. Like, what is politics? At bottom, it's people hashing out how society should be arranged. What is social science? It's people trying to determine how society is arranged, often with an aim of trying to, arrange it to understand different ways that it could be arranged and to address social problems and so on. So the overlap between what we do and politics is much tighter than is the case for non-social fields. And so the work we do as social scientists is very challenging. Compounded on these other problems of knowledge production, we have these additional layer of problems to produce social knowledge. The good news is we can actually overcome some of these problems to a degree working together. Under the right circumstances, we can collectively transcend some of our individual shortcomings and limitations. The core insight of the scientific enterprise in its recognizably modern form is that by competing against each other and by working together, by bringing together people with different backgrounds and different life experiences, working with different methods and different theories, but disciplined by common evidentiary standards and so on, it's possible to produce work that is different and better than anything we could produce on our own. We can produce something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. By colliding people with these different methods and so on, we can catch each other's biases, we can catch each other's blind spots, and we can produce something that looks more like objective, reliable, comprehensive knowledge. That's the good news. The bad news is this system only actually works as it's intended when you do have substantive diversity and pluralism. So in a world where research is produced by people who have by a narrow and idiosyncratic slice of society, by people who largely share the same values, they share the same worldviews, they share the same perceived interests, then these very systems that are supposed to correct for our biases can exacerbate them instead. It can become harder for new ideas to break through, precisely as a result of things like peer review and committee decision by hiring and things like this. These very systems and institutions that are supposed to make it easier and correct for biases can exacerbate them. It can become more difficult for errors to be overturned. You can see whole null fields of research that just persist for a distressingly long time, misinformation cascades. You get whole important questions that are just never asked, and so on. As a result, again, of these same systems. Some case studies in, if we want to see how the kind of composition of fields shapes the way the kind of knowledge that those fields produced, it's harder to find a better example than looking at the way that sex and human interaction was studied before the introduction of women into a lot of fields. So until recently, scientists were almost exclusively men. Men, the male scientists and male social scientists in particular, they didn't have access to women's life experiences, they didn't have access to female spaces, they didn't see female-to-female interactions much. To the extent that they interacted with women themselves, their interactions with women were shaped significantly by, sexual drives and desires and sexual tensions, and then also by social norms and rules that placed women in a relatively subordinate position such that they couldn't, they weren't on equal footing with men structurally. And so as a result of these structural conditions, and as a result of the fact that these male scientists couldn't access female spaces, didn't have access to female perspectives, it was really hard for these scientists to understand women as agents, to understand women as aggressors, to understand women as sexual beings or as intellectuals. And this mental block inhibited scholars from studying female intrasex or intersex competition for status and mates and resources. The idea was that women weren't into competition, they didn't care about status, they didn't do conflict, they were just these passive, gentle creatures. So as more women entered the field, these female scholars were like, no, women definitely care about competition, they definitely engage in conflict, and they helped produce a much more comprehensive understanding of human status competition, of cooperation, of conflict. The conclusion that ended up being created as a result of more women entering the field is that men and women tend to approach status competition and conflict in ways that are systematically different from how men do, but they definitely do engage in these things. And the fact that before, male scholars previously only focused on half the population and viewed the other half as, again, docile and physically and intellectually inferior, was a big limitation for us understanding human beings. Put another way, the kind of parochialism that we had in a lot of fields along the lines of gender, it didn't just restrict the demographic constitution of the field. So it wasn't just bad because we didn't have a lot of women and like half the population was women, but only a small share of social scientists were women. Like that wasn't the problem. The problem wasn't that just that it changed the demographic restriction of the field, but the lack of women also restricted and distorted the kind of knowledge that was produced. As female scholars were increasingly incorporated into scientific disciplines, they revolutionized our understanding of the human mind. They revolutionized our understanding of human interaction in psychology and philosophy and economics and anthropology, archaeology, primatology, you name it. Women have asked different questions than men asked. They pioneered new methods of investigation. They made important breakthroughs on longstanding questions. And these insights, critically, they arose out of their systematically different life experiences, their different social ties, their different social access. Again, women can study other women in a way that men cannot study women. They can enter into female-only spaces. They can talk with women in a way that when men are talking to women, there are different kinds of shields. So there's whole spheres of human knowledge that male scholars literally didn't have access to. Now, on the big question, like for instance, understanding women as agents, understanding women as intellectual beings, as sexual beings, as people who engage in competition and conflict, was it strictly speaking possible for men to have arrived at those conclusions that women are people in the same way that men are people, and people care about conflict, so women probably engage in conflict? Like, was that a possibility that was strictly speaking possible for male scientists to arrive at? Sure, but they didn't arrive there, and they probably wouldn't have if it weren't for the integration of more women into the field. The way that the male academics had understood these questions was informed in non-trivial ways by their life experience and social position as men, and the way female scholars approach these questions were no less influenced by their life experience and their social position. It's not like men were like biased and women were objective and disinterested. Like that's not what was happening here. Both male and female scholars had partial and situated knowledge. They both were analyzing the world in self-interested ways and so on. But they just had access to different kinds of knowledge. They had access to different kinds of social connection. And so by putting these perspectives into conversation with each other, we ended up with a much richer and deeper understanding of society than in the absence of that. And this isn't something that's unique to social science. So I listed a bunch of social science fields. But the same thing is true in medicine and in a lot of other fields. Before, largely male scientists were focused heavily on men, on male bodies, on male biology, and so on, and using that as a kind of standard for human beings writ large. As we had more female practitioners and scholars enter these fields, it actually transformed medicine, biology, and a number of other fields as well. So this isn't just a social science thing, this is just a science thing, that having more women in the field radically expanded and enriched our understanding of reality. And the same thing is true when you look at race. So, for most of the history of social sciences in Western Europe, scholars were near exclusively white. The study of race was largely an exercise in ethnic chauvinism. So when scholars tried to study the race problem, the idea, they largely pathologized aspects of non-white Anglo-Saxon behaviors and cultures to the extent that people diverged from WASPs. They just assumed that this was as a result of some deficit or pathology on their part. And they tried to point to these differences between white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and other people as a way of justifying inequalities, to justify domination of people outside of Europe, to undermine calls for civil rights and reparations. Example. So black people had to be largely stoic in the face of pain. If you were getting whipped by your master and you started whining or crying or something like that, they would often whip you more. And so a lot of black people in interactions with white people were very stoic in how they reacted to physical pain. Medical practitioners took from that black people just didn't feel pain the same way that white people did, leading to a number of really gruesome experiments and a lot of gruesome and a lot of really unfortunate medical interventions that even to this day, studies have found a lot of medical practitioners continue to think that black people don't feel pain quite the same way that white people do, and if they're looking for meds, then it's not because of their pain, it's because they're seeking drugs and so on. Likewise, similar to some of the kind of cognitive and social blocks that prevented male scholars from understanding women, the color line also prevented white people from fully understanding black people as people, because white people and white scholars primarily interacted with black people in the context of subordination and servitude. So most of the time when whites interacted with blacks were providing some kind of service for them. They were in a relatively subordinate position, they kept their head down, they didn't speak up, and so on. And so a lot of people took from these observations, they observed black people out in the world. They had interactions with black people, they saw black people, and on the basis of their actual observations, they came to the conclusion that it must be that black people are just naturally docile and servile. And that's because they were getting a very limited and distorted picture of African Americans. They didn't see black people trying to learn. They didn't see black people in their houses of worship. They didn't see black people nurturing their families. And so they just assumed black people were disinterested in these things. They couldn't go to black spaces. They didn't allow black people to go into their spaces. And even if a white person did enter a black community, if a white person walks into a black church, for instance, the way that people would behave, precisely because of the social risk during those periods, it would totally change the way that people behaved. It was like impossible, basically, for a white scholar to just study black people and observe a lot of the things that they might want to observe. So as a result of these kind of systematic distortions, to the extent that scholars studied the race problem at all, they were primarily concerned in the presumed deficiencies of non-whites. And they studied how social conflicts arose from minorities making unreasonable demands, like they expect to be free like everyone else, or they had kind of naive expectations about their appropriate role in their society. So this changed in large part because of the influence of non-white scholars. So you had black sociologists like Du Bois, who kind of turned the analytic lens around. So one of his big contributions was to study the race problem in a more expansive way, to include looking at the ways that things like racial discrimination and white supremacy and the legally and culturally enforced color line and historical disadvantage and so on might play a role in some of the observed patterns in society that people saw. What Du Bois argued is that it was not it's not a coincidence that when scholars were nearly uniformly white, they primarily studied non-whites in these pathologizing ways, and it wasn't a coincidence that Du Bois approached these questions from a different lens. One thing that's important to note about Du Bois, though, that's kind of lost because he's kind of been embraced in these literatures about changing the canon from white folks and so on. Like Du Bois was not an activist scholar. His big concern wasn't that the narratives that were being spread about black people were bad for black people. His big concern, his big beef, is just that they weren't true. He could look around and see that a lot of these narratives were just not true. He was a big fan of Weber's, what he called value-free ideal of sociology. He was a positivist. And so to help break out of these limitations, he developed, again, these kind of new methods of studying society. And in the process, in addition to kind of changing the theoretical frameworks that people were working from, in addition to asking different kinds of questions, incorporating more non-white scholars, also, like in Du Bois in particular, also changed the way that we do social research in another way. Du Bois was a pioneer in what we call today data visualization. These kinds of things that you see here, where you have longitudinal charts, color-coded, like aesthetically appealing ways of visualizing data and stuff. These are all normal today, but the Philadelphia Negro, before the Philadelphia Negro, which was where Du Bois introduced a lot of these methods, like social scientists didn't do this. And it's not a coincidence that someone like Du Bois would have been concerned about presenting data in ways that can be easily observed just by looking at it, and presenting data in ways that could be easily comprehended by other people. It was, again, a product of his life experiences, his social networks, the kind of avenues he traveled in, and so on. So he didn't just change the theoretical framing, he actually radically helped lead this revolution in the way that people do social science research and present their social science. As social science enterprises have continued to ethnically diversify, you've seen this expand. So when you started having more Hispanic sociologists, they kind of broke up this black-white paradigm. Almost all race research after Du Bois was kind of focused on blacks and whites exclusively, but there's all sorts of other people out there in the world. And so Hispanic scholars helped challenge this black-white paradigm. More recently, Asian and Pacific Islander scholars have focused more on Asian Americans, for instance, in the United States, who are largely neglected because people focus heavily on the more disadvantaged groups, Indigenous Americans, Hispanic Americans, African Americans. They largely neglect more perceivedly successful ethnic groups like Asian Americans. And so these are all cases where the field was diversified. The kind of questions that were asked were enriched and expanded as a result of folding more stakeholders into these institutions. You see the same thing with class. Pierre Bourdieu came from a relatively humble social background. You know, his dad was a post officer, his mom was a homemaker. He grew up kind of in the sticks. And so as a result of this background, when he entered like the French Academy, he was largely treated with disdain and was largely dismissed. And this created it lit a fire in him, but it also generated this kind of burning hatred of intellectuals and intellectual institutions that continued throughout his whole life. Even after he reached the kind of pinnacle of success in academia, he still had this kind of grudge. And this informed a lot of the way that Bourdieu went about his research. It informed his pugilistic writing. It gave him this kind of pugilistic style of writing and analysis. It led him to do a lot of public-facing work because he didn't want to deal with academics all the time, so he found ways to engage with non-academics. It also deeply informed his analytical approach. So looking at these institutions as an outsider and with this sense of alienation and frustration, it allowed him to see things that his colleagues couldn't see about the ways that these institutions functioned, about the ways that the role that intellectuals were serving in society. He wrote a great book called Homo Academicus, for instance, that looks at how during the 1960s, academics were often framing themselves as advocates for the marginalized and the disadvantaged. They were taking part in these anti-war movements and these women's liberation movements and so on and so forth. At least that's what they were doing on paper. But in practice, they weren't actually doing much good for the genuinely marginalized and disadvantaged. They were mostly just jockeying for position within the academy and enhancing their own position in the academy in practice. This was a hot take. It was a well-substantiated take, but it was a kind of take that it was a kind of hypothesis that he was drawn to, in part not because he was like dispassionately analyzing these institutions in an objective way. No. He was drawn to that hypothesis because he thought that his colleagues were full of crap, and he wanted to go prove that they were full of crap, basically. So he had this like highly motivated approach to studying these social issues, but these biases worked as a nice foil for the institutionally dominant view, and over time, as Bourdieu was forced to try to defend this position, these kind of arguments he was making from critiques from his peers who were part of the institutionally dominant group, it made everyone smarter in the end. And you can see this similar thing with politics. So for instance, most scholars in the United States were on the blue line of charts. Almost all of us are Democrats and liberals. And so whenever we want to understand anything that we think of as bad, our starting question isn't, how are Democrats contributing to this social problem? Our starting assumption is that it must be those damn Republicans who are creating this issue, to the point where, as you can see in this chart up here at the very top, so this is looking at polarization and expertise. So you can have a chart like this that shows the blue line is driving the polarization, shifting first, shifting far more. So we can produce a chart like that and then write an article like this about how, oh, why is there polarization around science? It's those damn Republicans. What is this? Why being anti-science is now part of many rural Americans read Republicans' identity, right? So you can have a chart that shows that there's this really funky thing going on with the blue line, and the blue line is driving most of the polarization, but you can write an article that completely ignores that line. And that's not unusual. In fact, as I've shown in some of my research, there's strikingly little work on why people vote for Democrats at all. Like, we don't even ask the question, why would someone vote for Barack Obama? Like, this doesn't strike us as like an interesting social scientific question. It seems obvious to us. We are very interested in why people vote for Trump. We're very interested in why someone would fail to vote for Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. And so we do a lot of work on those questions, typically appealing to deficits and pathologies, like which negative trait explains why people don't vote the way they should. As I showed in my essay, The Race for the White House on Social Research in the Age of Trump, and then more recently in this super viral Substack article called A Graveyard of Bad Election Narratives, a lot of the work on Trump and Trump voters chronically suffers from prejudicial study design, from like these glaring face validity issues that just get ignored. Like, so for instance, Donald Trump won in 2016 and in 2024, despite white turnout being stagnant, and in the case of 2016, getting a lower share of the white vote, but he was able to win a bigger share of the black vote, a bigger share of the Hispanic vote, a bigger share of the Asian vote. And yet Trump won because of racism? And like, there's this other face validity problem. If the issue was that, if you look at whose votes shifted over the course of the elections, the people who determined the electoral outcome in 2016 were mostly people who voted for Obama in one or two previous elections before voting for Trump. It's not obvious to me why someone who is incensed at the very idea of a black person leading America would choose to vote for a black person to lead America and then vote for them again, only to take out their deep-seated racial grievance on a white woman who is running with a white man. Like, there's a face validity problems to these narratives, right? And in many cases, there are even glaring errors in the published studies that not only get committed by sophisticated scholars, that can happen to anyone, again, we're all fallible, but what's striking is you can have this glaring, obvious error that not only can the scholar not see it, but the people peer reviewing it don't see it. And the people editing the piece don't see it. And the often sophisticated data journalists who cover the piece don't see it. And the people citing the work don't see it. It can be right in front of people's face, but they can't see it. Once you point it out, it's hard to miss. But until someone points it out, it's invisible. And so all of these cases are actually cases of the same thing. When we're looking at how the changing gender composition of the social scientists changed the kind of work that was produced, how the changing racial composition of social scientists changed the kind of work that was produced, how class and political backgrounds of social scientists shaped the kind of work that were produced. These are all the same phenomenon. They're all aspects of the same underlying problem. But that's often not the way they're analyzed or treated. Instead, often people who are sensitive to the ways that race and gender and sexuality can shape knowledge production tend to be really dismissive or skeptical about the extent to which ideological diversity is important. And vice versa, a lot of the people who are strong proponents of viewpoint diversity, understood in the context of politics and morality and religion, are often somewhat dismissive about the extent to which race or gender should matter in the social sciences. And this is a problem. This is a problem because these challenges are actually mutually reinforcing. Like, it's hard. If you want to diversify the range of views in the academy, it's hard to keep drawing from the same narrow and idiosyncratic slice of society, but somehow expect a much wider range of views. Or if you look at who is it in the United States, if you look at who is it that's most likely to be socially conservative, to be religious, and so on, it tends to be people who are less affluent, who are less educated, who are less urban, who are ethnic and who are ethnic minorities, and so on. They're the people who are more likely to be socially conservative and religious, and so on. And if you look at who it is that's most likely to be, quote, woke, it tends to be people who are highly educated, relatively affluent, urban and suburban whites. And so to the extent that you keep drawing from the dominant population, you shouldn't be surprised that you get more people who have the institutionally dominant view. Part of the reason why it is the institutionally dominant view is because it's the belief system of the institutionally dominant population. Likewise, academic freedom only has value in a context where you have diversity and dissent. If everyone just agrees, then you don't need academic freedom. To protect our ability to agree with each other? The main reason that academic freedom becomes valuable is when you have a substantive difference of views. And one of the things that we've seen over and over is that when you start restricting the sphere of views, when you punish people who diverge from the institutionally dominant view, often the people who suffer the most from that tend to be people who are already underrepresented in these institutions. So for instance, I can elaborate on this in the Q&A, I'll just skip over this for right now, but when institutions create anonymous grievance systems that allow people to kind of anonymously report anyone who says the wrong thing and so on, the people who become much more likely to be fired under that context tend to be people who are racial and ethnic minorities, less affluent people, and so on. And there's really interesting reasons for that. But the bottom line is, when you make it easier to punish people who diverge from the institutionally dominant view, the people who suffer most from that tend to be people who are underrepresented. And on the flip side, it doesn't do a lot of good epistemically. It doesn't do a lot of good for the knowledge enterprise. If you expand the range of people who take part, but they don't have the freedom to actually express what they think and diverge from the institutionally dominant view, that's how you get a lot of people who look different but think the same and talk the same. That I would submit that's actually what a lot of our diversity programs as currently structured tend to select for. And I'll add, diversity and pluralism, they're not just important for the knowledge production side of the equation, but they're also important for legitimacy and trust in our institutions. So there's all this research that shows for any kind of institution, anywhere in the world that's been studied, if people feel like they don't have a voice or a stake in an institution, if they feel like their values and perspectives are not taken seriously or not represented, or if they feel like the people who dominate that institution hate people like them, the natural response is to mistrust that institution, to resist it, to try to dismantle it. It would be literally suicidal to cooperate with an institution that's oriented towards your destruction or that's fundamentally hostile towards people like you. And so if we're concerned not just about producing reliable knowledge, but also making that knowledge have an impact in the world, having our institutions be trusted and institutionally supported, broadening the base of people who take part in the scientific enterprise is important for that reason as well. Now that said, so those are some of the reasons diversity is valuable. But there are some challenges in practice to diversifying our institutions. There's this phenomenon of what I call non-representative representatives, where a lot of the people who claim to speak on behalf of a group or represent a group are demonstrably not representative of most other people in that group. So if you look at black columnists for the New York Times, their values, their interests, their perspectives tend to be very similar to their white peers and light years away from the modal black American. We can see this in polling and surveys and lots of other things like this. And so this matters. The point, the upshot, is that what we shouldn't be doing when we talk about diversifying institutions is folding people into these institutions and then having a person serve as a stand-in for their entire group and kind of deferring to this person. So if you're a black scholar talking about race issues, you should just defer to this person and their preferences. This kind of a move, this kind of deference epistemology is not very effective. You want epistemic diversity, you want a large amount of stakeholders taking part in the knowledge enterprise, but that doesn't entail that you just elevate, because someone claims to speak on behalf or be associated with a group, that you just assume that they're speaking more truthfully or more honestly or take for granted that they actually represent this group. As I show in my book, in fact, if you look at black scholars in the New York Times, if you look at black scholars in academia and so on, most black Americans are monoracial, non-immigrant black people. those folks are almost absent in institutions. Like if you look at who are the black scholars who are in Harvard, almost all of them are people who are of recent Afro-Caribbean or recent African origin, people from Kenya or Jamaica in the last 2 generations. And the ones who aren't that are often have one or more white parents, or non-black parents, typically white. And so the kind of population of people who often occupy knowledge economy institutions and lay claim to labels like black just tend to be demonstrably non-representative of most black Americans. So this is why it's important to look at representative data on how most black people actually think or feel, rather than using individuals as like using black columnists at the New York Times as a stand-in for what the blacks think about something. Another challenge, or a thing to bear in mind, when we're thinking about diversity and its values and its implementation, is that it's important to understand the fundamental symmetries. Like the idea is, it's not the case that, again, that men are biased and women are not, or that whites are immoral and blacks are these altruistic paragons of morality or something like that. The idea should be that all of these folks are people. They're all have partial and situated knowledge that should be put into conversation with each other. And this is actually something that, if you look at Patricia Hill Collins, for instance, she wrote this book called Black Feminist Thought, which introduced the matrix of oppression framework, and she was a kind of key advocate of intersectional analysis and so on. And if you read Black Feminist Thought, though, Patricia Hill Collins says, like, based on a lot of the things I've argued, you might think that, queer people and women and non-white people are somehow more honest than whites, or more dispassionate, or more reliable truth tellers, have access to special knowledge, and so on. You might think that, but you're wrong. She says this. She says, in fact, again, we all have partial and situated knowledge. Black people are self-interested in the same ways that white people are. It's not that they're dispassionate. They're not any more altruistic. Women aren't any more altruistic. Queer people aren't any more altruistic. We're all people. This is in a lot of these literatures. It's been like largely lost in translation in the activist spaces. And the same thing with Edward Said. If you read Orientalism, Said didn't say that what you should do is you should take all the works written by the Orientalists, all the white works, and you should just burn them in a fire, and replace them with the works by people from the Middle East. Like, Edward Said taught literature at Columbia. The works of these dead white men were precious to him. They shaped him. They formed him. His argument wasn't that we should just take all that work and throw it in the trash and replace it, and take the subaltern perspective and the dominant perspective and flip them. Let the people who are oppressed experience, have their turn at oppression, and let the people who were, this wasn't Said's argument. In fact, and so when we're thinking about diversifying the fields and the value of diversifying the fields and the implications of diversifying the fields, the argument can't be that we just take the people from the dominant group and the people from the underrepresented groups and just flip them. Also, there's this kind of problem where a lot of the specific efforts that people do to diversify institutions, they just don't work. They're ineffective, they're often counterproductive. So I produced this resource for Heterodox Academy. I update it consistently on my website. Diversity is important, diversity-related training is terrible. It summarizes the empirical literature looking at not just diversity training, but similar interventions as well. A lot of what we do to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only does it not work, it actually undermines social cohesion, it undermines cooperation across difference, and so it's really important to be evidence-based when we're thinking about how to diversify our institutions and why that matters. And then I'll add, the pursuit of diversity often does conflict. So diversity and inclusion is one social good. It's one good for knowledge production. But there are a whole bunch of other things we care about in knowledge production, and some of them conflict with the goals of diversity and inclusion. So for instance, we have this tenure system in academia that a lot of folks like. I like it. But given that the societies in which we're in are changing consistently, it's actually tough to have institutions that represent society, which is in constant flux, if you have lifetime appointments. And so in order to have our institutions actually mirror society, if that was the goal that we were trying to aspire to, there's not a way to do that while having something like academic tenure. It's just impossible. So, one of the things that economists are good about, and that social scientists are less good about, is recognizing that there are trade-offs all the way down, right? So there are a lot of things that we value. They don't often, sometimes they conflict with each other. And so we have to make decisions about kind of what we pursue and how we pursue it. And then last two things I'll say about this, some other risks are that it can be easy when people are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion to kind of fetishize ratios. Again, like the baseline in society is this, the professoriate looks like this, in a way that like lose sight of what the actual prize is. Like the goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion, better said, diversity and inclusion in knowledge production shouldn't be to have the composition of the professoriate exactly mirror society. The idea should be to have enough diversity, enough participants taking part from different sectors of society that we can get more reliable knowledge, that some of the kind of dominant perspectives can be more easily challenged, that we get this kind of richer range of views. That's the goal. There are some reasons for optimism. So again, like our default is to sort with people like us, to kind of engage in these motivated ways in our thinking. And the composition of fields does shape the knowledge that's produced and so on. And a lot of the challenges that institutions face in reforming are significant. But the upside is our institutions have been reforming in lots of ways. And as Matt Grossman argued, social science is probably better today than it's ever been in many respects. As a result of efforts towards reproducibility, transparency, things like this. If you look at even like the really top studies from generations ago, like landmark studies, a lot of those wouldn't pass peer review today, and they wouldn't pass peer review today for like quality reasons, because they don't control for obvious confounds, they don't, right? They have really small sample sizes, they're making big generalizations from, so social science in many respects is getting better. Hiring and promotion also it's more standardized than it's ever been, it's more open and transparent than it's ever been, it's more competitive than it's ever been, almost to a sick degree, it's more metrics focused than it's ever been. Like a lot of folks who seem to think like, well, back in the day, before this concern with DEI, like apparently we used to only hire and promote people on merit, even though the hiring pool was restricted ex ante to straight white men. Like somehow that's not identity-based hiring. Anyway, people like often misunderstand the status quo ex ante. In fact, as I show in this piece on my Substack, the kind of the rise of meritocratic hiring and promotion and more standardized evaluation and things like publication, peer review, and so on, this was both a product and a driver of growing diversification in the academy. There's actually a lot of positive trends. Now, there are some real challenges, to put it mildly, and there are some problems of progress. So some of the ways in which we transform these fields create new problems. So for instance, when you change the composition of fields to include more women, and women engage in status seeking, competition, things like this in systematically different ways than men, then this changes the norms of how academic institutions function in ways that will often be uncomfortable for like the dudes who formerly dominated those institutions. And some of the ways in which this changes the cultural norms might be for the better, some for the worse, who knows? Well, it's complicated, I guess. And so there are some challenges. This is tough. As HxA's president, John Tomasi, put it, we're struggling to give birth to something the world has never seen, a fully inclusive university that is primarily and unambiguously and joyfully committed to the communal search for knowledge. I think that's a beautiful vision, and it's something that I'm looking forward to working with you all to continue pursuing as well. Thank you for your time. So
we've got some time for questions, and then Rachel is monitoring the online Q&A, so maybe we'll get some questions there. So we do only have sort of about 15 minutes for questions, so do sort of keep your questions short and to the point if you can, as we go through this. So I'll come round and hand over the mic if anybody wants to jump in with a question. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. Could you talk a little bit about the use of power by those in the identitarian movement? I notice a kind of thuggery and a lack of due process in the way power is exercised.
Yeah, I mean, and so one of the contributions that I hope my work in general makes, including my book, which I have that up there as contractually obligated by Princeton. They'll murder me if I don't urge you to buy the book. It's available now in paperback. Okay, but one of the things that I stress in my work is that a lot of people who take part in these institutions depict themselves as these helpless cogs, as these powerless people, when in fact, they're social elites by almost any measure of social, and then even within these institutions, right? They wield significant power, but they're often not aware of how they're exercising that power. And actually, there's ways and there's kind of some of the narratives that we use in the service of diversity, equity, and inclusion actually help obscure the power relations and the way that the power actually operates in these institutions. And so, yeah, I think this is a problem for both conceptually and like practically in terms of making these institutions function the way that might be more reliable for knowledge production, that people are not often aware of their actual social position. They're not aware of the power they actually exercise and how they exercise it. And so I think, so what I try to do in my work is like make that more obvious and transparent to people.
Thank you so much, Musa, for this inspiring talk. I have a question about diversifying the academia. And I just recently, last week, listened to the podcast by Helen Andrews, who wrote the book about the great feminization. And that was interesting to hear that argument. So she argues that right now it's not only the presence in academia, but over the prevalence and dominance of women in some of the fields, in fact, changes the academia in so many different ways. And she even argues that these changes she links it to the woke culture, cancel culture, the focus on more empathy than the reasonable debate, silencing people over disagreeing just because of the difference between men and women. So my argument is and in Canada, we're still social engineering. We're still hiring people by race, by gender. So what do we do with this? Because these changes changing the disciplines, changing the new generations of new faculty, new students. Do we do anything about this? How to address these, many changes in academia for years to come?
Yeah, I mean, my kind of friendly amendment to Helen's argument is that I think she kind of I think the argument explains too much as it's currently structured. So one of the things I show in my book, for instance, is that a lot of the ideas and norms and frameworks, including cancellation, all of this stuff that we've seen since 2010 is actually a case of something. And there were 3 previous awakenings over the 20th century. And as I show, but you can compare and contrast these cases to get leverage on like, well, why do these awakenings happen? Do they change anything? And so on. Okay. So the fact that a lot of these institutional dynamics and a lot of these ways of thinking and talking actually predate 2010, and also predate the demographic shifts that Helen is talking about, suggests that gender is maybe less, isn't the cause. Now, that said, one thing that I do note in the book, and that I think is important, is that it does matter. So one of the big arguments of my book is that one of the big drivers of the awakenings is elite overproduction. We have more people who have a reasonable expectation to be elites than we have space to give them the lives that they were taking for granted. Okay. Now, one thing that's changed over time is that it used to be the case that the elites that were overproduced were exclusively men. And now, increasingly, women are being overproduced. And this matters because they do engage in these struggles in systematically different ways than men, right? And so the kind of flavor of these awakenings is different in a world where you have, where a lot of these knowledge spaces, from journalism to higher ed to the nonprofit world and so on, are increasingly dominated by women. The way these struggles play out is different, like it's different flavor. But the idea that, but for women, we wouldn't have woke. That I think is too far. It's too strong of a claim because you can observe a lot of these dynamics that play before women were even part of these institutions. Now that said, to more substantively answer the question, and I'll stop talking. It's definitely the case, though, as I said, that the composition of fields doesn't just change the knowledge that's produced. It really does change the dynamics of it changes the way how people relate to each other, how these institutions function. And so I think one thing that we have to, that we do have to focus on over the coming years and decades as these gender transitions continue, is to think about, well, what aspects of the kind of male-dominated knowledge production space are good and worth preserving, and which aspects kind of suck or kind of less worthy of esteem and preservation, and and in what respect and to what aspect can we maybe keep some of the more positive aspects of the formerly male-dominated approach to a lot of these things and incorporate it with some of the better aspects of the female, more female-centric modes of competition and inquiry and stuff like this. To the extent that there are these systematic differences, I think the way forward is to think in terms of trade-offs, right? So what things are kind of worth keeping, what things are better and worse, and to try to strike a different balance.
Okay, this is a question from Judy online. I often hear the line that truth leans left, that the reason that there are more left-leaning academics is because that's where the truth brings us. How would you respond, Musa?
Yeah, as they say, Stephen Colbert used to say, reality has a well-known liberal bias or something like that. Well, I would say a few things to that. I guess first, where's my clicker? First, I would say, if you want to understand, again, a lot of social phenomena that we claim to be concerned about. So if we want to understand how it is that if we truly believe that Donald Trump is a fascist and a threat to democracy, and we want to understand how someone like him ends up in power, then it's actually really important to look at, well, why did growing numbers of young people, women, African Americans, working class people, gravitate towards voting for this person, even as the privileged people, white people, relatively affluent people, super rich people, highly educated people, and so on, why did those people shift to the Democrats? It's really important to understand in a sober way why this person won, and to understand why the very groups that we say that we're trying to help are being alienated from our preferred political party. Likewise, if we want to understand, one of the things that I show in my book is that if you look at the kind of most liberal places and institutions in America, they're not paragons of equality and social harmony and cohesion. They're some of the places where a lot of these social problems that progressives are concerned about are actually most pronounced. Like New York has the most racially segregated school system in the country, despite immense amounts of wealth, also has one of the largest poverty rates in the country, and therefore has some of the highest inequality in the country, and so on and so forth. And so if it was the case that all of these left-aligned people with their good values and their access to the truth would, and that the only problem in society is these regressive, backwards, blah, blah, blah folks, then it's kind of hard to understand why a lot of these social problems are most pronounced in places that Democrats control with one-party rule and conservatives are basically absent from. Truck drivers are a lot more diverse than academics are. Why is that? And so on. So that's, I guess, my nutshell response to how to respond to that.
Thank you for your talk. My question is, what's your opinion on the enterprise in the realm of knowledge production in journalism, such as free press, or maybe specifically Barry Weiss? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a good case. on how, so I wrote a piece on this actually just recently called Putting the Culture Back in the Culture Wars, where I talk about the free press specifically, so I'll refer people to there but the broad point is I think, again, there's this point about symmetry is very important. So the problem in journalism is that there's too many people who belong to one particular political faction. The problem isn't that that political faction happens to be on the left. Like there's not some unusual characteristics of left culture that are responsible for a lot of the biases and oversights that we see. You see a lot of those same biases and oversights. And a lot of the same kind of censoriousness in other outlets as well. The free press being an example about this. I hadn't talked about it before, but I talked about it on my Substack, so I'll just talk about it now. I actually had an interview with the free press that was censored. And it was because most of the interview was about my book, but in the last 5 minutes, the interviewer, for whatever reason, decided to talk about Middle East politics. Either they assumed that I was on the same page as them about all of the issues, or they assumed that if we were on different pages, he could easily ensure that the correct side won out. That's not the way that 5 minutes went. And so rather than airing this episode, which might challenge some free press readers' assumptions and antecedent views, and that models constructive disagreement, we weren't yelling at each other or anything, it's a very amicable thing. The interview was just spiked. They just killed the interview, never aired. And if you read the free press, for all of its virtues, one thing that you will see, though, is a complete lack of viewpoint diversity about Middle East politics, for instance, and on other issues. And so the problem is not, the problem that we're trying to address at Heterodox Academy, in my view, is not the left. The problem is that when you have any kind of ideological position that becomes hegemonic in this way, when you have any particular faction that becomes institutionally dominant in a way that freezes out incompatible and otherwise contradictory viewpoints and perspectives and stakeholders, like that's a problem for knowledge production. And so the goal is to prevent these kinds of monopolies. And so one of the risks that a lot of organizations intended that are in this space have run, that I've observed over my time working with Heterodox Academy, this isn't so much a problem for Heterodox Academy, but it's definitely a problem for other organizations I've observed, is that it can be easy for a lot of these outfits that are supposed to add more viewpoint diversity kind of collapse into a monoculture of their own, where it's a whole bunch of people like sitting around agreeing with each other about everything and how free-minded and open-minded they are, even though they're not actually disagreeing with each other about anything. They just all agree that the left sucks, basically. And so, you know, it's really important to, like, again, the takeaway that we should take from a lot of these literatures in the cognitive and behavioral sciences is that these are universal human tendencies that all people are prone to. They're not unique characteristics of the left or anything like that. And so anytime that people are organizing for the sake of knowledge production, we have to be aware of the potential for these tendencies to kind of sort in with people who are like us and affirm, look for evidence in these kind of motivated ways and reason in these motivated ways and so on.
Okay, so we have time for one last question from Mark, a quick question.
Quick question. That's difficult. I was going to ask two. So just one then. If we want to diversify viewpoints on campus, especially amongst the tenured faculty, given the challenges you were talking about earlier, how do we do this without engaging in a sort of DEI-like selection for, say, conservative folks? I'm not interested in engaging in that sort of selection process. I think, I support academic freedom and meritocracy and all that sort of thing. So, I'm not in favour of that sort of selection, but how else do we do this? This seems like a fundamental, you've highlighted a fundamental problem. How do we overcome that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say it's actually the same kind of challenge, right, that institutions face about trying to address any other kind of diversity too, right? Like if you think it would be useful to have more black scholars or more military veteran scholars or more female scholars or whatever, like how do you do that in a way that actually doesn't lose sight of the main thing that we're trying to do at these institutions, right? And doesn't become a kind of numbers game or a box checking game or something like that. That's a real challenge. And one of the things that you definitely see in some spaces, and I talk about that on my Substack, I have an essay called The Cultural Contradictions of the Anti-Woke. And what I show is that, especially since the rise of kind of the Trump 2.0 administration, there is this move in a lot of right-aligned circles to basically do DEI, like anti-woke DEI or something like that. And I agree with you, I don't think that's the way forward for a lot of the reasons that a lot of the current DEI programs fail. One challenge, so you might think, okay, well the solution, what the solution is we just need to lean harder into meritocracy. The problem with that is that a lot of the specific, that might be a way, but we'd have to like really think harder about the specific criteria that we use to measure merit. Because right now, for instance, if what we measure merit by is like, did you graduate from an Ivy League school and did you publish in the very top journals? But there's cabals of scholars who basically, if you say the wrong kind of thing, it's really hard to publish in the top journals and to get into the top schools, then our definitions of merit will filter out people who color outside the lines, right? They also, incidentally, they also filter out people from less advantaged backgrounds and so on, typically as well. And so I think one thing that I think in principle, what we should be doing is focusing on what it is we're trying to accomplish, right? What is our goal? Where do we need to, and staying focused on that. And I think something like meritocracy, loosely, is kind of a useful direction to do there. It kind of disciplines these judgments. So you're focused more on less subjective kind of measures to evaluate whether or not to incorporate. So I think like meritocracy is the right direction to go in. But I think we do have to think a lot harder about the specific metrics we use for merit than we have so far. I think there's this assumption that a lot of the measures we currently use for merit are just good measures that just objectively measure scholarly worth and don't have problems, but and don't have like problems with respect to being prejudicial towards ideological in other groups. And I think that's just not. I think every aspect of that is kind of a problem, but it's tough. If you're on a hiring committee, I've been on a hiring committee now. You get 200 apps. You can't read everyone's work. You can't read 200 essays, right? And so like some of the heuristics that we've developed for that is, well, let's just see if they published in a top journal. Let's just see if they went to a good school. But the problem with that, again, is this is a good way to filter out people from non-traditional academic backgrounds and people who have non-typical academic views in practice.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. I'll thank Musa again.